National debt, debt ceiling, defaulting on our debt. What does all of this mean? Well, if you've opened up any news channel within the last month or so, you've probably heard all about this national debt or this debt ceiling or this debt default that's going on. So today we're going to talk about what the debt ceiling is, what happens when the USA defaults on its debt, has this ever happened before, and what I think is going to happen. So just like people and businesses, the United States has its own type of debt, and that's usually referred to as the national debt. Unlike the average person sitting around $96,000 of debt, the USA is a bit higher at that, sitting close to $32 trillion. Yep, not much. Just a bit higher, $32 trillion. You heard that right. Unlike the average American, the United States government debt wasn't created by shopping or buying new bags or buying new cars. It's created because the United States over time has to fund things like the military, which debt is sitting around $800 billion, Social Security, which is about $1.3 trillion, and Medicare, which is about $1.5 trillion. And if you're like me and think the interest on your mortgage payment is high, imagine the interest payments on a $32 trillion debt. It's sitting around $540 billion per year. Aside from the predictable debts that we know, like military, Social Security, Medicare, other things that contribute to the national debt are when they have to pass a $2.3 trillion stimulus package because a global pandemic has shut down the whole entire country. And you can imagine how many things have happened over the last 200 years of this country existing, 250 years, where we need to fund them, where pandemics happen, where global crises happen, where the financial crisis happen. All these things require new stimulus packages to fuel the economy. So depending on the current state of the economy, the United States debt can go higher depending on what's happening that year. So now that we got an understanding on what the national debt is and where it's standing, let's take a look at the topic, which is the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is basically an amount that Congress sets and is later passed by the president, where they specify a cap or a ceiling to what the debt can reach. So right now, the debt ceiling is at $31.4 trillion, and the debt is sitting at $31.2 trillion. As you can see, we're awfully close to that debt ceiling. And once we reach this debt ceiling, the United States is no longer going to be able to make those payments towards its debt, which can further lead to a debt default, which we'll cover in a bit. So as you see, we're pretty close to this debt ceiling. We're about $200 billion away. So the United States has two options when it comes to the debt ceiling. Number one, which is find a way how to lower their debt and make more payments so they're actually paying down the principal and not just the interest. Or number two, raise the debt ceiling and say we're going to allow you guys to have $35 trillion in the United States, or $38 trillion. One of the reasons why it's not good to just keep raising the debt ceiling higher and higher every time we get close to it is because it's just kicking the can down the road. Many people believe we actually need to start a plan and start paying down that debt rather than just raising that ceiling higher and kicking the can down the road. Now, how does the United States get debt? Who are they in debt to? So the United States gives out bonds, which are basically IOUs. They'll sell the certificate saying, buy this for $100, in 10 years I'll pay you $104. Basically, I owe you $4 on what you gave me. It's a way that they can raise money to build things and pay their military and pay Social Security and so on. These bonds could be sold to normal people, you and I, so yes, the government does owe you money when you buy those bonds. Or other countries like Japan, who is currently holding $1.1 trillion in US Treasury debt. Or China, who's holding about $900 trillion in other countries worldwide. So debt default is when someone who has an obligation to pay back a debt based on certain terms is no longer able to pay down those bills or no longer willing to pay down those debts. And as you can imagine, if this is happening on a global scale or when the United States is no longer willing to pay back their debts, it's going to have worldwide repercussions. So what would happen if the United States actually defaulted on its debt or saying we no longer can pay back our debt? Well, number one, all the bonds that people buy, or even other countries, like I said, Japan, $1.1 trillion worth, is no longer valid. So by defaulting, the United States is saying that bond that you bought from me, I'm sorry, I can't pay it back. I have no more money, or I'm unwilling to pay back on those terms. So for the average person, this will cause a sell-off in bonds. Bond prices will drop, a lot of people lose their money, and then you have a dominoes effect from there. People lose their money, the GDP goes down because people aren't able to spend as much because they have less money. The GDP goes down, people start losing their jobs. If people start losing their jobs, we run into the recession, and then down goes the economy. Being the global powerhouse that the United States is in the world economy, this just won't affect the average American. This will affect all different countries that the United States borrowed from. Now, narrowing down to what will happen with the average American is, like I said, people will lose jobs, GDP will slow down, a recession was probably likely to happen, higher interest costs would happen. So you think that 7% mortgage rate is high? Imagine the United States defaulting on their debt. So borrowing money would just become so much more expensive all over. On top of that, United States wouldn't be able to pay their employees. So federal workers that they have nationwide, like the post office and so much more, will not be able to get their money. Other people that will be affected by this is people on Social Security and Medicare. So overall, if this was to happen, this would not only affect the United States American, this would affect the whole entire world. As like I said, the United States is a leader in the global economy. Now, all we've been seeing in the news nowadays is fear-mongering. They're talking about how this needs to happen now. This is already 2 weeks too late. If it doesn't happen by this date, we're all screwed and the world's going to implode. While luckily this has happened in the past, the United States has been close to its debt ceiling, but spoiler alert, they have never defaulted on their debt. Now throughout history, there has been countries that have defaulted on their debt. The first example is Argentina. They had about $100 billion in external debt that they defaulted on. They had 40% inflation throughout the country and their GDP fell by 11%. To give you an idea on how bad that is, average inflation in GDP should be rising by 2 or 3%. Not falling by 11%. In the late 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the early 90s, Russia was also in a situation where they defaulted on their debts. This led to an inflation rate of 84% and many banks closing down. Venezuela is another country that has been dealing with a financial crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a hyperinflation crisis, and now it's even dealing with a debt default. Because of their hyperinflation, Venezuela is not able to pay out their debts to other countries. This ends up resulting in limited access to international financing. Other countries aren't going to want to lend to you or invest in your country if you can't pay back their debts. So where does Congress stand on the US debt default or the debt ceiling today? Have they agreed to increase that? Well, at the time of making this video, and I say that because it can change any day or any moment, they still have not decided on a plan for the debt ceiling. As you know, Republicans and Democrats do not agree on a lot of things, but mostly money. The Republicans are going to want to do one thing with the money, the Democrats are going to do another thing with the money, and that ends up being a whole big game of tug of war and no one ends up winning. So as it stands today, in order to limit the debt that the nation has, Biden and the Democrats want to raise taxes on the wealthy or on the rich. This way they can raise more money and actually pay down the debt. Obviously, the Republicans aren't going to want to do that. The Democrats want to eliminate some loopholes that the wealthy use, but on the other hand, Kevin McCarthy, who is the Speaker of the House, says we're not doing that. On one hand, McCarthy wants to cap the spending at 1%, and on the other hand, Democrats are not willing to agree with that. Some things that the Republicans want to cut are things like the incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act, and obviously the Democrats are not willing to do that. So as you can see, there's no shortage on disagreements here. So what do I think is going to happen? Well, personally, I'm not listening to the media who is fear-mongering and saying the economy is going to crash because the United States is going to default on its debt and the stock market's going to crash 45% and everyone's going to lose all of their money, because in the end, the media is paid to scare the people. It's not meant to make people feel happy. People are going to tune in if they're scared. They want to keep up with the latest news and see what's happening. Instead of listening to the news, I'm going to use logic, and I'm going to assume that the people like the Democrats and the Republicans in Congress are not going to crash the world and affect their stock portfolio and cause a recession or even a depression in the whole entire country. I'm also going to realize that the debt ceiling has been raised 78 times since 1960. What's the difference if we do it one more time? And I think that's exactly going to happen. They're going to raise the debt ceiling yet again. In 1996, the debt ceiling was at $5.5 trillion. If you told people back then we're going to be at $25 trillion, let alone $31 trillion, they would probably say the economy in the United States is going down the drain. The way I look at it is now we're at $31 trillion. 10 years, we're probably going to be at $50 trillion. And it's going to be kicking the can down the road until we figure out a plan to actually pay down this debt. So I hope what we went over today makes things clearer, and now when you're watching the news and seeing that the economy is going to crash in 10 days, you actually have some sense of what's going on. So if you guys enjoyed the video, let me know your thoughts below. What do you guys think is going to happen with this debt ceiling situation? Like the video, subscribe to the page, and we'll see you guys in the next one.